Good day, everyone. Good day from the Philippines. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to friends and guests who are joining us from other parts of the globe. My name is Daniel C. Retilla, the Program Head for Climate and Disaster Resilience at the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and I will be serving as your host for today's event. Today is the second session of the 2026 Climate Research as If People Mattered webinar series. And if you're curious about the title, it draws from the article Small is Beautiful, Climate Change Science as If People Mattered, written by Dr. Regina Rodriguez and Dr. Theodore Shepard, the co-chairs of the My Climate Risk Lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program. The article reflects on insights from E.F. Schumacher's celebrated book, Small is Beautiful, that may be applied in closing the gap between how climate information is being produced and used. 2 weeks ago, we launched this series with a session about radical hope as a framework for climate action. And so this series also jumps off from its sister series back in April, Climate Voices on the Ground, the perspectives from different sectors, where we explored the different contexts and experiences of climate change. In this climate research series, we will then see how these perspectives inform how we can structure our research and management plans. This series is organized by the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, which is hosted by the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. My Climate Risk, or MCR, is a lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program, which aims to develop and mainstream a bottom-up approach to regional climate risk. Today's session also occurs exactly on World Environment Day, a chance for all of us to reflect on the beautiful planet that is our common home. The theme for this year's World Environment Day is climate action, so it is incredibly meaningful to be having our discussion about two of the world's most critical biomes today. Just some reminders before we start. Please note that the program is being recorded on Zoom. On Zoom, all participants are muted automatically as they enter the meeting room. We also encourage participants to keep their cameras off throughout the event, except during the group picture taking. Throughout the session, kindly type in any comments or questions in the chat box here on Zoom. Participants through our Facebook Live may also type in their comments or questions in the comments section. But if you are feeling shy and would like to remain anonymous, please feel free to send our tech team a private message. We will collect these for the open forum later on. And finally, there will be an evaluation survey at the end of the session. Requests for e-certificates may be made through the same form. And at this point, we would like to ask everyone to settle in and join us for an interfaith prayer. I invite everyone to make the sign of their faith or to join us in meaningful contemplation as we recite an excerpt from the Interfaith Liaison Committee to the UNFCCC. We give thanks for this unity of purpose. We give thanks for the beauty and wonder of creation. We give thanks for the lives and experiences which inspire and illuminate our commitment. We pray in our hearts to reject fear and embrace love, hope, and transformation for a more healthy, safe, clean, and sustainable world. We pray for the protection of climate activists and environmental defenders who often risk their health, if not their lives, in advocacy. We pray for protection of climate scientists so they can work without intimidation and with sufficient funding and support. We pray for protection of the poor and most vulnerable communities, those least responsible yet most affected by our insufficient climate action. We pray that our leaders grasp the urgency expressed in the latest science and guide our economic systems to reject dependence on extraction, exploitation, and accumulation through dispossession. We offer these thanksgivings and prayers with all that is in our hearts, some of this still making its way into words. And so, To formally welcome everyone to today's webinar, it is my pleasure to call on Dr. Maria Loris Hamero, the Resilience Coordinator of the Klima Laboratory at the Manila Observatory. Dr. Hamero is also a collaborator of the MCR Ateneo Hub, and so we're very happy to have her with us today. Dr. Hamero, welcome.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Good afternoon, everyone, and happy World Environment Day. Thank you so much for taking the time to participate in this very important webinar. So, back in February, I was in the UK and I had the chance to participate in a workshop organized by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, on engaging diverse knowledge systems. So basically, the workshop is a very strong and welcome indicator of the interest of IPCC to integrate indigenous knowledge and local knowledge into its assessment, hopefully including the current cycle, which is the seventh assessment report. Now, coincidentally, in the same month, the My Climate Risk Education Working Group also launched the Climate Science and Colonialism training module. So, if you haven't seen that training module yet, I highly recommend you to check it out. But basically, it was a very powerful reminder of the colonial legacies and extractive tendencies of traditional climate science, which we need to keep in mind, especially as we begin this work of engaging other ways of knowing. So, indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and even practitioner knowledge are valuable in many ways, but some of the most widely documented ways are its value in helping us better understand observed climate change. So long before climate models have been developed or climate information have been downscaled at any meaningful resolution, local communities have already observed changes in temperature, rainfall, um, timing of the seasons, especially for indigenous communities who have a very intimate connection to their environment. Another way is through the adaptation strategies. And so we always hear about the need to come back to indigenous or traditional practices in order to adapt to the observed changes. But one of the novel ways, I think, and this is the topic of this webinar, so that's why I'm very excited about this, is that indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, practitioner knowledge can also help us understand the observed impacts of climate change, especially the negative impacts of climate change, which is already going into the territory of loss and damage. So, when it comes to understanding observed loss and damage, attribution science plays a central role. So basically, we try to understand how much of this impact is actually attributable to climate change. So while that is good, we also know that there is an imbalance in the availability of attribution studies, the majority of which are coming from the global north, and so there is basically a blind spot in the global south where most of these impacts are happening in the first place. And so what I wanted to say is that attribution is not just a technical issue, but is actually a matter of equity and justice. So we have a clear task ahead of us. For scientists, we should not let attribution prevent us from assessing observed negative impacts of climate change anyway. And for local communities, we need to come together and develop strong evidence rooted in diverse knowledge systems to help us really capture the harm that we are already experiencing because of climate change, with the ultimate goal of moving from evidence based decision making to evidence informed decision making, where we don't only consider scientific knowledge, but also other ways of knowing. So, with that, I hope you enjoy the webinar and I hope you enjoy shining a light on one of the most pressing blind spots of our scientific knowledge today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamero. Indeed, it's very heartening to know how much the conversation around other ways of knowing is changing and how we are expanding the tent to include the voices of those who are most affected, those who serve as stewards, and how we can respectfully consider these in how we respond to the climate crisis. That will certainly be a great foundation for our talk today. And speaking of which, it is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Maria Barbosa is a wildfire scientist at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, working at the intersection of climate change, wildfire dynamics, and societal impacts. Her research focuses on understanding the drivers of extreme fire events and their links to climate change. She is a core team member of the State of Wildfires project and the scientific lead of the BASE project in Brazil, where she explores ways to connect fire modeling research with community knowledge and local experience. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed speaker, Dr. Maria Barbosa. Dr. Barbosa, or Maria, it's great to see you again, and the floor is yours.
Hi, hello everyone. Thanks so much, Daniel, for the nice introduction and for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. And I'm going to share my screen just a second. Oh, 1 second that I'm hiding the control panel. Yes, there you go. So yes, today is gonna be, I'm going to talk about this very special project where I had the pleasure to meet Daniel, where the main goal was to attribute to climate change the 2024 fire season in Amazonia and Pantanal. But before I start I don't know why it's not passing. Okay. So before I start go into the research, I talked a little bit about my background. Daniel already covered what is my research is about, but I wanted to say that I'm a forest engineer. I have a master's in environmental and forest science and a PhD in remote sensing. And that's a little bit to say that I've been working mainly with, the physical aspects of fires since my undergrad. And this is the first project where I actively include people on this whole on this whole process. And yeah, it's very exciting. I learned a lot, and I hope I can, improve this forward. So I did a postdoc in Brazil for 6 months in a different area, doing restoration in the Atlantic forest, and then I returned. Actually, I moved to the UK last year to join the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, where I had the opportunity to join this project. A little bit of what I'm going to cover. I thought to give a brief context on the 2024 fire season and the regions I'm going to talk about. Also, I will explain what is the basic project and what's the main goal. One slide on the key people and institutions involved on this project, a little bit on the methodology, and I will share what were my personal lessons and experience with this whole thing. Then I will go through the summary of the results and other documents that we produced within this project and what are we thinking moving forward. So the 2024 fire season was very extreme in the Americas especially, but also in Amazonia and Pantanal. We had like unprecedented forest loss because of fires, a huge problem with air quality that led to several health implications throughout Brazil, not only in these regions, but the smoke was carried to different parts of the country, including the southeast, which is like the richest cities and had like severe impacts from this. But one thing that we realized is that the impacts for indigenous and traditional communities, especially in Amazonia, was very disproportional. And we registered food shortages, water pollutions, a lot of health impacts. And they are the ones, as Daniel said, that contribute the least for this type of problem. Covering a little bit the regions that I'm going to talk about, I'm sure everyone knows where Amazonia is and how the biome is compounded, but I wanted to show Pantanal. So Brazil has 6 biomes. It's not the exactly same definition as the international biomes. It's something more specific for the country, but Amazonia is the rainforest, as we all know, and Pantanal is one of the largest wetlands in the world. And as we can see, is the smallest biome in Brazil, and Amazonia is the largest. Also, these biomes, they have different relationships with fires. We have biomes that evolved and depend on fire, and this is the case of Pantanal, Cerrado, and Pampa. Cerrado are the Brazilian savannas, and Pampa, they have mainly grasslands there. Pantanal has a mosaic of vegetation, so wetlands, savannas, small patches of forests, and grasslands. And we have biomes that are fire sensitive, as Amazonia and the Atlantic forest. And also Caatinga, which is a semi-arid region, and this kind of fire doesn't actually have like a bad or a positive impact. So going to the project, what is BASE? So BASE stands for Building Approaches to Fund Local Solutions with Climate Evidence. And this is a project funded by Fundación Avina, which is an organization from Argentina. And the main idea here is to promote more and better access to climate finance for local communities. So that's why this work is very much related to the loss and damage agenda. And the idea is that the research, the scientific research can, resonate more and include the community's perspective. I don't know why the panel control was back, but let's keep going. So talking about the key institutions involved in this project, I kind of divided in 3 lines. So the first one is the institutions involved with the science, the quantitative part of this research, which is the UKCH, LASA, which is a lab on the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and INPE, which is the National Institute for Space Research, also in Brazil. In the middle, I added the people's institutions because I will expand on this later on, but these are the organizations that allowed or connected us with the local communities and indigenous communities. So COIAB, which is the coordinations for the organizations of the indigenous peoples in Amazonia, in the Brazilian Amazonia, and Fundo Casa, which is an NGO that has this amazing network within Brazil with several communities and local firefighters. And we have the funding institutions. And here I am adding Avina Foundation, as I mentioned, the Argentina who supported this whole project, the My Climate Risk, and Rede Clima, which supported one of the workshops that I'm going to talk about later on. I also wanted to share some key people that made all this happen. So I had to mention Doug Kelly, which is my colleague at the UKCH and helped me loads on the scientific part, on the modeling part. Also Renata, that unfortunately couldn't be here because of the time zone, but she was key to connect with the communities. She led the workshops that were in person with the communities, and I'm going to talk a little bit more later. On the middle, we have Tainan, which is an indigenous firefighter, volunteer firefighter, and also she's from the COIAB, which is the coordination for organizations of the indigenous people in Amazonia. And she was responsible to make the connections with the indigenous land that we visited. And Beatriz Rosero from Fundo Casa, which has an amazing relationship with several volunteer brigades, volunteer firefighters throughout Brazil. And on the funding and connecting people parts, I wanted to highlight Victoria from Avina Foundation and Fiona Spule. Victoria, to have this initiative to connect people, and Fiona, which was the person who brought me to the project, who introduced me to a lot of people, including Daniel, who invited me today to give this talk. All right, so moving towards the methodology. So I mentioned that the goal was to attribute the 2024 fire season in Amazonia and Pantanal, and how we did this. So we have a model, a conflame model, which I will talk in the next slide. And the idea was to carry an attribution analysis, but we tried to do this alongside the community's knowledge. And we use for validate our model design, but also as an independent line of evidence to show how extreme the 2024 fire season was. And this panel keep appearing, is so annoying. Sorry for that, but I need to hide because I can't see the slides. All right. So the conflame model I just mentioned, it's Bayesian framework modeling, which means it models a probability distribution where we can simulate several of thousands words with different interactions between variables. And one thing that we can do within this model is to group variables into what we call controls. And here we chose 4 controls, which is weather, fuel, ignitions, and suppression. And what the model does is to multiply the contribution of each one of these controls, and then you have the predicted monthly burn area as a result. And this is the model and methodology used in one of the lines of evidence of the State of Wildfires report, which is a annual global assessment that looks to the extreme events on the year before. So this year we are working on the last year's fire seasons, and we have some study cases where we look to impacts, attribution, future projections, drivers. It's a very comprehensive, and I invite you to go to the website if you want to know more. And what metrics we calculated with this model? Here I'm going to focus on 2, which is the amplification factor, which compares the total burned area under the observed on the world with climate change with the burned area in a world simulated without the climate change. And the risk ratio, which compares the likelihood of the specific event we are analyzing in a world with and in a world without climate change. So talking about the community's engagement, we did this through 3 workshops, where the first one, we had this meeting with volunteer firefighters from different regions of Brazil. And the firefighters, they were all voluntary, and they the operations are mainly in protected areas. In this map, I'm showing the protected areas that they are from the Amazonia and Pantanal, where we did a participatory exercise with them to understand what were the perceptions on the 2024 fire season. Also, if they are observing changes in the rainy and dry season in these regions, what were the impacts on the territory that they perceived, and the information, how they get the information, and what are the future perspectives on fire activities, in the region. Here it's a little bit of what they reported. We have a lot of material on the outcomes of these workshops, but I wanted to highlight the changes on the use of fire. I think it was an interesting observation. This before and after the past, we tried to set like 10 years ago or something like that. And they reported that in the past, they would see more traditional use of fire, the Sweden agriculture, also more natural fires. but also they would see land clearing, fires set to clean areas for pasture and agriculture, and also criminal fires. And after, or we mean like today, they reported more criminal fires than before, also more accidental burning. This means fires that should be controlled, but because of the weather, because of longer dry season, they lose control and go into to the humid forest, or what should be a humid forest. Also, more fires is spreading from deforestation, mining, and other types of burning. But another nice thing that they registered is that in Brazil, we had a zero fire policy for a quite long time. And then now, after the approval of the National Policy for Integrated Fire Management 2 years ago, we are returning to the traditional use of fires and prescribed burning and, cultural burning, which is a positive aspect for today. They also reported the impacts on these areas, so more time demanded for firefighting, more diseases due to smoke exposure, less harvesting, shifts in harvesting periods, and food shortage for the communities that live there. This table is showing the reported changes in dry season and rainy season before and after climate change. And what we can see here, the red ones are the dry season and the blue ones are the rainy season. And the first line is before, the second is after. The first one here, the dry season, I'm going to focus on the dry seasons just to show that they report a kind of shift when the dry season starts, and also increase in the length of the dry season going towards the summer, which is the rainy season in Brazil normally. And here we have the Pantanal, which they also reported a shift towards more or less a month to the beginning of the dry season and extending until October. And the tone of the colors means that more people agreed with this, because we have different perspectives, so not always people will agree. For the second workshop, this was a visit in indigenous lands in Amazonia, the south of the Amazonia state, the Kaititu indigenous land, where we had 120 participants. And for this workshop, Renata, which couldn't be here, unfortunately, she was the one visiting, so I was not there, but I will try to share a little bit of her experience. And she said that the first idea was to have like a smaller group so we could interact. And we set a kind of 25, I think, people at most. We talked with COIAB and they talked with the communities. But then people were so excited to talk. They were so happy, because I think not a lot of people goes there to listen to their needs, to listen to what they have to teach us. And then 120 people participated. They just showed up, which was in the end really, really nice. And they had a lot to say. And I will share a little bit more about this afterwards. I won't be able to cover everything. As I mentioned, we have a lot of materials on what they reported, but I wanted to highlight that they could see the difference on the 2024 fire season. It was more intense than previous years. It caused a lot of damage on the indigenous land. And they could see that the fire would start outside the indigenous land and spread to the inside. Also, they mentioned that the most affected villages were closer to the urban area, and a lot of smoke covered and impacted the indigenous land, especially in August 2024. Together with them, Renata draw this kind of conceptual scheme on the impacts of the fire season, of the 2024 fire season. And other impacts that they reported was the Igarapé drought. Igarapé, for those who are not familiar, are these narrow rivers that are located within the forest, and they are very, very important in the context of traditional indigenous communities, as they serve as transportation, also, as water availability, food availability, and they reported that they were dry. Also, the regions where they had water access, they were very polluted with fish poisoning. The fire ashes can cause large pollution on the outer bodies. They had a huge problem with food. One of the community's members mentioned that it was the first time that they had to buy food in the city, which for them is like a big deal. They have this different relationship with the food, with the land, and to have to buy outside, it's just because they really need it, because the agroforest was damaged, but also because the production of the food, even if it was not burned, the production was reduced because of the dry and hot weather. And they also reported that I think in the indigenous land, it was the first time that a cacique, a member of the community, died because of health issues, because of the increased exposure to smoke and toxins, and also the food insecurity. But one thing that we realized is that they also have solutions. They already know what they need and what could, minimize and solve a lot of the problems. And I wanted to highlight a little bit of what they shared. So the indigenous is a huge land and they have these villages. And one thing that they proposed would be a group of firefighters or a brigade for each community. Also training on fire control and prevention. This is something that they already do. They are already doing prevention in their lands. And if a fire happens, they are the first to respond. But of course, training, they normally have specific people with this knowledge. So training on this and support on this would be very essential on this climate change scenario. Also, more inspection to avoid criminal fires, especially surrounding the indigenous lands. They mentioned the cleaning of igarapés, also more funding. And one thing that is very important, more communication tools, because when something happens, how can they communicate without internet, without radio, or other tools that they can use to ask for help or for support? And finally, the third workshop was the multi-stakeholder workshop where I actually met Daniel. It was in September last year in Brasilia. And the main idea of this workshop was to discuss a little bit what we learned from the engagements with the firefighters and with the indigenous community. Oh, and I should say that we didn't have scope to visit a community in Pantanal this time, unfortunately, but this is something I wanted to do in the future, and I want to find funding to do it because I think, this is a gap maybe for this study. We could only visit the communities in Amazonia. But returning to this third workshop, we gathered together indigenous leaders, volunteer brigade members, researchers, civil society organizations, and policymakers to say, okay, this is what we learned from the communities. I presented preliminary results of our modeling approach, the attribution analysis of these fire seasons, and then we discussed if the model design was appropriated, if the controls or the variables were making sense for that regions. We also discussed a little bit of these preliminary results and how we could improve this information, and a lot of challenges and limitations on doing this type of work and how this can actually inform and be relevant for the loss and damage and other climate finance tools to support communities to get access to those. I won't go into details, but after this discussion in the workshop, we had a kind of final model approach. And here I'm showing the final controls for Amazon and Pantanal. They are different regions, so they are slightly different. And another thing we can give to the model is the expected effect of the control burn area. So that's why weather and moisture and ignition and fuel, we expect that they increase fires, and the suppression is the one that we expect to decrease fires. And a few aspects that we discussed and learned from this workshop was the importance of include road density, for example, for Amazonia, but not for Pantanal. I think we would probably include roads anyway, but was interesting to discuss that this variable might not make sense for Pantanal. Pantanal is a very preserved region, and also, as I mentioned, is a mosaic of vegetation. So this fragmentation, it just doesn't make sense for Pantanal. And also we had to include wetlands, as fires in Pantanal, they are closely related with the wetlands. So normally during the dry season, when the wetlands reduce, then you have grasslands growing and you have a more fire prone. You increase flammability, you increase fires. And that's also one of the reasons why 2024 was so extreme, because Pantanal was experiencing a drought, a long-term drought since 2019. We also discussed to use regional or local data. In this case, we included in our model approach map biomas. And one thing I think was interesting was to learn about this time period. I showed you the table with the changes in dry season. Normally for attribution analysis, we look at the peak of burned area, or we can always look to the whole year. So what we decided to do was to Amazonia to include the whole year, because we have different dry or fire peaks depending on the region. In the north, in the Roraima states, we have fires happening normally during the summer, which is a different time period from the rest of the biome. So we decided to look to the whole year. This also based on the discussions. And for Pantanal, we decided to be more targeted and look to May to September, which was where the firefighters said was the peak of burning, the peak of their operations inside the biome. Then sharing a little bit on how we formed these relationships and what we learned and how this impacted like my personal research. Starting with the relationships, as I mentioned, we had two organizations making these connections. This is very essential. You need to build trust with communities, with local and traditional people. You can just, go there. So this was essential. We had the Fundo Casa, as I mentioned, with the firefighters network in Brazil, and they were having events that allowed us to engage and go and participate and talk to firefighters from different regions of Brazil. And the COIAB, just a second. And the COIAB was the organization who made possible the visit to the indigenous land. And one thing we learned with this experience, especially the indigenous land, is that it's important to communicate early, to understand, to give them the whole explanation of what the day is going to be about, what is the goals, what are the expectations, the questions that we are going to ask in advance, so they can reflect upon and make the activity more dynamic and maybe effective. Is not as we usually do and go there and just do everything at the moment. So we need to plan, we need to have, trusted partners to make this happen. Another thing that we learned a lot from this is adapt as you go. We had to change a lot on what we planned, especially for indigenous communities. For the firefighters workshop happened first, so we learned a lot in the first workshop and made some changes. But even with that, because it was the first time that we were doing this, at least from my side and from the science team side, we had to adjust. One thing that we always struggle is the language. So for the indigenous community workshop, we had also a facilitator, which is kind of used to do this type of moderation on these activities. He was also already familiar with the communities. They knew him already, and it was also essential to help us to, communicate, translate what we wanted to do, what we wanted to say, and not make like very difficult and very technical for them. And we had to be flexible, for example, with the number of people we are not expecting. We had to simplify some activities so everyone could participate somehow. And one thing that we learned, for example, that before and after question that we made for the firefighters, for the indigenous communities, that didn't work that well. So we had to change our language to something like, when you were younger, growing up, how would you see these changes compared to today? So this is the type of adaptations that we had to do. And sharing a bit of the lessons for me, I think for the group, I can say, Tainan, as I mentioned, she's from the coordinations of indigenous organizations, COIAB. She also a volunteer firefighter. And we had the pleasure to meet her on the Brasilia workshop, on the third workshop. And this picture I'm gonna mention afterwards. We had a COP30 event where she could participate because of the support of the Avina Foundation. They provided blue badges for a few communities, representatives, so they could, be in this space and be able to engage and participate on these side events. And I felt like her intervention was one of the best I saw at COP30. And just quoting her, she shared how the climate change, how fires are impacting, her life, her community. And she said, we are losing the culture of fire, its knowledge, its spiritual meaning, its role in community life. One thing that she reported is that in the past, they would be able to see natural signs on how the rain was coming, and this would allow them to plan when they would use fire for spiritual meanings or even for agriculture, small agriculture in their lands. And now they can't do this reliably anymore because things are very unpredictable. And now they are afraid to use fire and then start a big fire in their lands. But one thing that she reminded us is that fire is a tool of care and not a tool of destruction. It's not meant to be, this destructive. So fire is not the problem. Fire is a good thing. The problem is that we are losing the control. We are losing our relationship with fires. And I think since then, I have been trying in my talks that have a different audience, people that are very much on the modeling side, trying to remember this, trying to remember the good, the positive aspects of fire. And also I feel like this is a responsibility for scientists to communicate. Of course, we need to communicate, we need to say the impacts, the negative aspects, but not all fires are bad. Even under climate change, not all fires are bad, and we need to remember that. Another thing that we heard a lot, learned a lot, and realized is that they are the first one to respond when a fire happens. Can you imagine, I don't know, in Amazonia, forests start to burn? They can't wait firefighters to come. And the first thing is that normally the firefighters will come from different regions, so they won't know the lands very well. And it's going to take a lot of time to get there. And the response when a fire starts is essential, like the time of the response, because once the fires get peak, mostly there is nothing you can do. It's very difficult to control. So the important thing is the prevention actions and also the time that you respond. So they are the ones that are doing this already. And also, I feel like it's very important that the discussions of the communities are increasing everywhere, that they should be the center of the discussions, the center sometimes of the solution. But that's the thing. Sometimes they are expected to do this whole work, to have all the solutions. And despite that, they receive limited or no financial support, and they contributed little or nothing to the climate crisis. So this guy, João, his name, he talked to us about how they dealt with the fires in the land. So even if you're not an indigenous community, normally the volunteer firefighters, they are members, of the communities, members of the cities. And they told us a story that when they were kids, fires. But again, this is not Amazonia, so this is a region where fire is a natural component of the landscape, and they would, as kids, use their flip-flops to suppress a small fire as a kind of game. And when they grow up and things start to change and fires become bigger and more destructive, that's how and also why they decided to join these brigades. And you can see that he has like equipment, clothes, but this doesn't come from the government. This is mainly supported by the NGO I mentioned, Fundo Casa. So Fundo Casa has this whole goal to support local solutions, to support local communities. So they are the ones who will receive funding. And that's one of the things that they fund, equipment, like basic equipment, because these brigades has no financial support from the government. They are not paid. Very often they have to pay to go to places. They have to pay because they sometimes will miss their work, and they won't be paid because of that. So they can help the community to deal with a fire event. And I wanted to share a bit on my personal experience. As I mentioned, this project is very special. I don't think I mentioned, but I'm from Brazil. I'm Brazilian. Maybe this is obvious. I don't know. But even though I'm based in the UK, so for me, it's always special to be back to my country, to do research over there, and for the first time to include people's perspective on my work. And what I learned from them, from the visitors, from the discussions, is that as scientists, we are not helping as much as we think. And we should be very aware of that sometimes our papers, nobody reads, or maybe it doesn't get the impact that we would like to, and maybe that's something to think about it. Also, I was very surprised. Maybe this is silly of me, but this was my first engagement, like face to face with people dealing with fires. And I was amazed on how much they know already. Like, I was the one learning, and we have this idea that because we have, I don't know, formal education on such subjects, we might be able to teach a few things, but I totally felt it was the other way around, because they know the technical parts too, and they have the knowledge of the land, which is very essential. So it was very good to hear all the tools, the maps, the data that they use, how they communicate, how they act when a fire happens. And again, all these clothes, all the equipment are made from the organization supported from the organization from Beatriz. I felt like the work are so amazing and highly undervalued. Like I mentioned, no direct and financial support coming from them. They mostly survive from NGOs. They need to apply for funding. And I think the main the main message that I took from this experience is that we need to do research with the communities and not for the communities. I think this is something to stress, that we are not there to teach, we are there to learn, to listen, and to actually make the research make more sense for the context. And I want to keep doing this type of research. So this was the first time. I loved the experience, and I'm very looking forward to ways of keep doing in other regions maybe, but also there to improve how we do this integration or how we do this complementary analysis. So for the little bit less interesting part, I thought to share a bit on the results, on the attribution results. What we found for Amazonia is that in 2024 was 2 times larger, the burned area was 2 times larger and 3.5 larger in Pantanal because of anthropogenic climate change. We can see this is a mean for the period that we looked at. We can see the regions where this was more pronounced. Also, we calculated the risk ratio or the likelihood of such events. For Pantanal, for Amazonia, we found the event was 50% more likely because of climate change, and 7 times more likely in Pantanal because of climate change. So from this project, we produced a few documents already. This project, it's towards the end now, at least this first part. And last year we published a comments paper on the recognition of loss and damage from wildfires and how this is key if we want to talk about climate justice. And we used this comment to produce our policy brief, where we engaged in several events, not only me, but the Avina Foundation, everyone involved on this project. We wanted to more than show the attribution results, but really discuss and really bring the idea that we need to use at least the community's local knowledge as one more line of evidence on climate change. And also we need to directly address and recognize loss and damage from wildfires in the official loss and damage agenda, which is not currently. And that's how we can also make sure communities are able to access this type of fund. So with these documents, we organized a few 2 side events in COP30. And also, I didn't add it here, but we also have a smaller version of the policy brief, which was handed to community representatives that went to COP, so they could also advocate for themselves. I think this is a very important part, that they see their knowledge in the documents and that they can use that to advocate for them. So a little bit on the COP30 events. These were the main 2. The first one was the one I mentioned, Tainan participated, was focused on Amazonia, where we shared a bit of our experience with this project and learned also with other researchers from Amazonia. And the second event was focused on Pantanal. It was more policy focused, I would say. So trying to discuss integrated fire management in terms of policies, early warnings, and then we shared the Pantanal perspective of this project. And it was nice to see in this COP30. It was my first time at COP, but what I heard is that there were more indigenous and local communities in spaces at the Blue area. And they were, keen to talk. It was really nice to see. There was some very nice interventions, some uncomfortable ones, I would say, but very necessary. And what's next? So, as I mentioned, we are towards the end of this project, of this part. Last week, I have submitted the paper that tells the story and go into details on these results I have just showed. But one thing that we learned, that we heard from the communities, and that we think is very important, is that we need to return to them, not only go there and collect information, but what can we bring back to them in return. And they often say that a lot of people go to talk to them, especially the firefighters in this case, but never return, and they never know what was done with this knowledge, what was done with these materials. So we are organizing a webinar in the end of this month to present all the findings to the local firefighters and to the partner institutions. So we have these two spaces, and we are also developing targeted materials to be shared with the indigenous communities. This one, the Avina Foundation is supporting, because we need a more specific language, a more specific way to develop this material, and this will be shared and worked with the community so they understand what happened and what we learned from them and how can they use this information. And for me, I feel like I want to keep including and learning from people as much as I can. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. I mean, wow. Research with and not just for communities. I think that's my takeaway for this session. And it's really so inspiring, but at the same time also heartbreaking to see how local communities, whether they're indigenous or otherwise, are really rallying together to protect their lands. I remember in our workshop in Brasilia, we had noted that it's difficult to measure love. It's difficult to measure attachment to land. And even although as climate scientists, we're always obsessed with, the quantifiable parts of the model. And so it's wonderful that, you also get to share this through your research with the rest of the audience here today. So at this point of the program, we'll now be having our open forum. We have gathered some of the questions in the chat, both anonymous and both public. So I'll start with the first question, which is an anonymous question from one of our participants. And the question goes, is there a role for early warning systems in preparing for fire weather? Are there traditional cues to signal that fire is going to happen? And just coming in, I know you mentioned earlier that Tainan mentioned that the way that the way that they handle fire is no longer the same as how their grandparents did. So I wonder if those traditional cues have also changed.
So the question is if there are early warnings that we could. It's just because I missed a little bit the beginning.
Yeah. So the question is there a role for early warning systems? And perhaps how do traditional cues play a role in this?
This is a good question, and is one thing that the communities mentioned is that would be useful for them is the seasonal forecast, like a fire risk for the day, or 3 months in advance, and even for a year in advance, because then they can better prepare. I think this is something that was not in the scope of this research, early warnings, but we did do some future projections. Unfortunately, in the long term, like decadal future projections, and we were discussing how we can make this more useful in the short term. As we discussed, this could help them more in the day-to-day basis. And even the traditional use of fires, like I think it could support the preparation for the fire season if we had some information on this sense.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. And really that I appreciate that your answer also sheds light on how complex this issue of wildfire and wildfire management really is. Earlier when I was reading this question, I also just realized that, that's right. We didn't really talk much about early warning systems, but there's certainly a role for that. And perhaps that's a question that, funding is related to. So I would like to pivot a bit to the next question, and this is from one of our participants, Marvin Tejada. Um, and Marvin writes, there is what foresters call managed and intentional burning. Do you think that vast tracts of forest lands were unmanaged due to the lack of forest professionals and perhaps the lack of forest management funding? So, funding for how we manage our forests.
That's a good question. I would say that in Brazil, um, mainly the fires will occur outside the forests. So they will occur in the surrounding areas when they have agriculture, pasture, or deforestation happening. Um, but of course, there should be space for forest managers. I think this is very essential. And also, one thing we should point out, like the protected areas and the what we call conservation units in Brazil, they are the ones where we have the firefighting operations. So if you have a forest that is a land, how do we say, a land that has kind of no one to look after, has no owner, let's say, then you can easily have, a deforestation, a fire happening in that land. So I feel like we have to, we have a term in Portuguese. I'm not sure how it is in English, but anyway, we have to find a owner. I will try to improvise for the forest that are left alone lately. But also we need to inform and fiscalize and try to think about how we use fires for agriculture, for pasture, especially because of climate change. You have a burning that should be controlled, but then you lose control because of the weather. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. And I guess what you were also trying to say is that because there are lots of land that is sort of like a no man's land, it's hard to know, who is responsible for this or who
Yeah.
should be, involved in, discussions about managing fire in this certain land. And that's certainly a tricky situation, especially, and I'm not sure if this is also the case in Brazil, but in so many other parts of the world, lands that were formerly managed by indigenous peoples, have been stolen from their traditional stewards. Okay, and then some of them have really just gone into neglect. And so
And
I want to, yeah, go ahead.
just to complement, because in Pantanal, the dynamics is a bit different because Pantanal is mainly private owned. So it's 95% of the biome is private lands. So it's a different way of managing that. And the forests are the smallest portion of the biome. You have mostly wetlands, grasslands, savanna. And one thing that we heard, I don't know if you remember from Christian Berlink, he's the coordinator of the integrated fire management in Brazil, the policy. And he said, like, it's very difficult to get to someone's property and say, oh, you can't use fire anymore, especially in a biome that fire is normally expected and it's a good thing. So it's another way of managing, another way of dealing, and it's never easy. We are learning.
Yeah, definitely. We are learning even as scientists, and I really like one of your last slides. You really emphasized that sometimes you have to realize that we as scientists are not helping as much as we think we are, and there's always room for more respectful dialogue. So I just want to pivot a bit to another funding related question. This is something that appeared in the workshop, but perhaps you could also expound a bit more. And so the question asks, what is the most effective way that funding can support local communities, considering both short-term funding, such as increased training and healthcare, or long-term funding, such as mitigation policies? So based on your experience, what do you think could help these communities the most?
Okay, I think in the short term, like you mentioned, like the person mentioned, the training, but also like basic equipment, communication tools, as I mentioned on my slides. Also, it's very important to facilitate the access for this funding. As I mentioned, the Fundo Casa is one of the organizations that does this very well, but normally to access funding is something very bureaucratic. And, not the communities will even know that this is available or how they can apply. So you need to have this kind of bridge to connect the local people to access to funding somehow. And I feel like as scientists is one of the things we can help with through, of course, with other partners together, but, to make the information we are developing more accessible and to get to the community so they can use that to apply for funding. But one thing that, for example, regarding the firefighters, I forgot to mention, is that is a profession that in Brazil, at least, is not regulamented, is not official, let's say. Even the ones that are not volunteer, even the ones that are paid, they are hired in a short-term contract basis, something like the fire season, 3 to 6 months. Lately in Pantanal, this changed a little bit, so they were hired for 2 years, which is something, but let's be honest, who wants to be in a job that is very unstable, and that you risk your life. They don't have health insurance, for example. This is another thing we learned from their testimonies. It doesn't exist health insurance for firefighters, for forest fires. I also need to mention that there is a profession firefighter in Brazil, but deal with fires in urban centers. But what I'm talking here is the forest fires, is the one that happens, in vegetated areas. And this is the one that have no support. And I think this is the first basic step. We need to recognize this profession. We need to give stable jobs, health insurance, and all the support they need. I think this is the very short-term thing that should be happening. And then we can think about actually planning for the long-term, adapting. The prevention measures is something that should be funded. A lot of these volunteers, they work for the fire season, but they also do the unpaid job throughout the year with prevention measures within their lands. But, it's not fair that they do this for free and sometimes paying to do it. So that's what I think.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. So I'm taking away two things from your answer. First, that communication really is important. It's important to know how these lands can be better connected to the larger, better equipped fire brigades that are usually, located further and further away from these traditional lands. And then, of course, the formal recognition of firefighting as really a part of the economy with all of the attendant protections, the social protections and benefits of other parts of the economy. And so there's this, I assume the last question about funding, unless, of course, other questions come in. But this is more of your experience as a researcher looking for funding. How difficult or easy was it to look for funding in your experience, given how famous the Amazon rainforest is, the biome is, and given how valuable the interaction with local stakeholders is? I imagine that funders are key to support projects like this, but I could be wrong. I could be making it sound much easier than it sounds.
That's an interesting question. For this project in particular, I kind of didn't look for funding. Fiona connected and the funding was already secured, but the funders, they wanted to look to Brazil, but we had to include Amazonia, you're right. And then we could include some other regions. Amazonia always is the star, let's say, of Brazil. But I think there are two things here. So the funding that us researchers or maybe big organizations, even an NGO that does local work, but we have this type of funding, which I feel is kind of easier to get, even though it's not that easy, but maybe because of competition and these type of things. But it exists. I think that's what I wanted to say. But for this money, for this support, just this funding to actually make a difference for the communities, I think we are very far from make this real, from make this reality. I think as I mentioned, as researchers, we often have all these publications, all these nice messages, these nice numbers, big numbers from media that you maybe will give an interview, have your name in a lot of places. But is this actually making any difference to day-to-day lives for people? I don't know. This is the hard part. And even if you, like I mentioned, if it's a big institution, we have the Amazonia Fund, for example, but you need to be like a big NGO, a big organization to apply for this. And I think this is one of the nice things of the Avina Foundation that they want to include, and they actually want the community to get funds. The Fundo Casa is the same. So they are not looking for bridge organizations that will give the money for the community. No, they give directly to the communities. They simplify the process of reporting back, because this is another thing. Like, funding is crazy. You need to report so many things. It's like overwhelming for us. Can you imagine for people that has to deal with fire impacts, act on the day-to-day life, and then write reports and give receipts and these kind of things. So we need to simplify this so they can also are able to use, to apply, to have access to these funds.
Yes, I really love how you mentioned that it's really cutting that middle process, that red tape, and getting the resources to the people who need it, regardless of the organization that that serves as that bridge. So yeah, it's so happy to have that peek behind the curtain, and I'm sure that a lot of the other researchers in the audience also appreciate you sharing about this experience, and hopefully they are also as lucky as you are to have that funding come to them. So, uh, we have room for maybe a couple more questions. There's this one question that I really wanted to pick your brain on, because you do work on wildfires more than most researchers that I've met. Why do you think that wildfires have not yet been included in the mainstream loss and damage framework?
This is one of the things we discussed in the workshop with Fiona and Victoria. One of the things that they often focus on slow onset impacts. So, for example, sea level rise is one of the impacts they most focus on. Also, wildfires becoming like a hot topic is something very recent. In the last few years. So I think we have a lot of work in recognize how this is an emerging threat to especially local communities. Also, they see wildfires sometimes as like a secondary consequence, because you have the emissions, you have then the drought happening, and then you have like a wildfire as a kind of third, second thing happening. And I feel like now we are putting wildfires in the center of discussion a lot more. And I feel like we will start to change that. But if you look to the loss and damage documents that we have so far, we have very little mention to fires. They are normally in brackets, like, oh, for example, fires, but they were not addressed directly. But I feel like we are making progress, and this should change in the next years. I hope so.
Yeah, so something that's always in the background, but hopefully we can push a bit forward, because we know that the problem is going to, get worse as the climate crisis also worsens. And perhaps as a last question, I also just want to acknowledge the question in the chat by Marvin Tejada. And Marvin writes, globally, the prevalence of wildfires is affecting populations, their properties, and the environment. Do you think that despite having endemic or native species, despite being native to the area, do you think that once they become plantations, their ability to combat such occurrences of wildfires has worsened? perhaps this could be worsened because they have become plantations, or perhaps worsened because despite the fact that they can respond to wildfires, the external pressures of the climate crisis are just too much.
For species that are normally adapted to fires, that's understood correctly?
Yes, so those that might be adapted to fires, or those that are already used to, because some of the biomes have evolved with fire, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think I think one aspect is even for endemic trees, okay, even if a place evolved and is adapted to fires, the fire regimes are changing everywhere, even in these areas. So one thing is to have natural fires that are normally small patch areas that happens during the rainy season. So you have a fire because of lightning, for example, and then afterwards you have a rain that will extinguish that fire. What we are seeing now is more fires during the dry season. So these fires are more extreme. They are very large in intensity and the area that they cover. So even species that evolved with fire will be damaged. There are some studies showing that, for example, in the Brazilian Cerrado, which evolved with fire, fire is a normal, natural component, but because of agriculture, you're right, because of deforestation, all the changes in the climate, all these pressures together, the environment can't cope, the species can't cope. They will be damaged, the biodiversity will be damaged. And this is something we are seeing a lot in regions that, has fires as a natural component of the landscape.
Yeah. So it's like a lot of factors that are pushing these biomes, these ecosystems into different thresholds, thresholds that are really testing the resilience of the larger climate system, in fact. And so, Maria, this has been such a rich discussion. I wish we had more time because, there are so many different ways that this discussion can really deepen. And so thank you very much for your answers, Maria. And thank you as well to all of our participants for your questions. This has been such an engaging open forum. And so I now want to move us to the awarding of the certificate because, we've had such a valuable time, learning from you, Maria, and also having this deeper discussion. And so I'll just read the citation. We present this certificate of appreciation to Maria Barbosa for sharing her time and insights in the webinar entitled Integrating Bottom-Up Approaches into Climate Attribution, Evidence from Amazonia and the Pantanal, on the 5th of June, 2026. This certificate is signed by myself as the focal point of the My Climate Risk Ateneo Regional Hub and by Dr. Emmanuel De Locado, the director of the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. So thank you very much again, Maria, for sharing your time and insights with us. But now, to deliver the closing remarks, it is my honor to call on another collaborator and a dear colleague of the MCR Ateneo Hub, Mr. Reginald Rex Barrer, a lecturer at the Ateneo School of Government. Mr. Barrer, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Let me close the webinar this way. And again, in recognition and appreciation of World Environment Day, it would be important to reiterate the need to develop and mainstream examples of bottom-up approaches to regional climate risk and to bring people's experiences on the ground to the fore, as Daniel mentioned, and highlight the perspectives of different stakeholders and sectors on their experiences of climate change, and how they use climate information in addressing climate risks, primarily in the global south. Dr. Maria Barbosa, obrigado. Your work gave us a front seat to the relevance of fires as a critical indicator towards further building our knowledge on climate attribution, a very critical area for research where we are in our effort to combat climate change. Particularly its importance in improving our appreciation of climate-induced loss and damage. Very importantly, engagement, as you've stated, with communities and an appreciation of indigenous knowledge as a form of bottom-up engagement and approach is very critical in understanding the complexity of climate change dynamics and how we can address their impacts. Now, let me just note key takeaways from the presentation, and I think I will be carrying this in my own work on climate change first. As you mentioned, communities know a lot more than we probably know, not only for you, we all expect. No? Research with communities and not for communities is very important. We often find ourselves now with the kind of work that we do that we tend to think that we gain knowledge for our own purposes. But in fact, it's most important to ensure that the benefits to those research uh, are gained by those who need it the most. No? And these are the communities that we work with. No? Second, quite interestingly, I find this a very appropriate way of looking at fire as a tool of care, no? And we're looking at these webinars as a form of care, in fact, and that fire as a tool of care rather than destruction reminds us of or allows us to look at fire, no? As an early onset technology. Quite interestingly, I put it in that context. That even as concern is increasing with regards to how fire has contributed to forest impacts that exacerbate climate change, it is important to consider that fire can be seen from the lens of what we can take advantage of, no? But because it has been used either way, and should be taken with the care that is necessary if it is to be of use to us. Last but not the least, this is something that has always been reminded of our work, where people have contributed the least to this crisis, to climate change. They are the ones who have always been affected the most. And I hope there will be a lot more opportunities for you to share your work through the Ateneo Hub, if not elsewhere. No? Let me also thank everyone in the audience for the questions, for the exchanges, for the perspectives that you've provided, and for spending the time with us this afternoon. I hope you found the opportunity as enlightening as I did. No? Have a good rest of the day while reflecting on the knowledge we gained here this afternoon. Again, obrigado, Dr. Barbosa.
Thank you so much. That's really nice. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation. It was a pleasure. Have a nice day, end of the day for you.
Thank you, Maria. I hope you can stay for a bit for the next part, which will be a photo opportunity for everyone. But first, I do also want to thank Mr. Barrer. Indeed, it's really important that we can reframe how we do research so that we do research as a form of care. Because fire does not always have to be an element of destruction, but it can also be an element of care. And so I'd like to ask if the audience can turn on their cameras momentarily for our group photo. This will also serve as our documentation. But if you'd also prefer to keep your cameras off, that's also fine. I'll give a few seconds for the others to also turn their cameras on. Right. I will be taking a screenshot in 3, 2, 1. Thank everyone. Let me take a second one just for safety here. Okay. Taking it now in 3, 2, 1. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. It's always nice to see your nice smiles, and hopefully the new faces here can also join us for our next session. And so while today's session certainly covered a lot of ground, especially when it comes to not only listening, but also integrating the voices and knowledge of local stakeholders, in our next session, we'll take you from one side of the world in Brazil back to the Philippines. That will be in a couple of weeks on the 17th of June. So I don't know if members of the audience have noticed, but this climate research series has been a very international coverage. Our first session featured a Filipino researcher in Australia. This session features a Brazilian researcher in the UK. And our next session will be an American researcher in the Philippines. And so the next webinar is titled Community Perspectives on Coastal Resilience, a baseline assessment of 3 coastal barangays in Sablayan, Occidental Mindoro, with our speaker, Alyssa Kemp. In the meantime, if you'd like to learn more about the Ateneo Hub, why not visit one of our featured projects? We have built a steady repository of climate articles supporting the research capabilities of our student interns, which is a play on the Filipino phrase, climate and, which explores the connections between climate change and the everyday. Another featured project is the Climate Stories Initiative. We believe that we are all storytellers and scientists. And if you have a story about how climate has impacted you, we are interested in reading it. And so together we hope to build up a Southeast Asian, if not global South voice. But more than just a compilation of stories, we also hope to have a series of submissions where risk perception is seen. And so you may visit the site on screen to access the guide questions and select a few as your prompts. So we've sent into the chat not just the registration link for our last session, but also for the links that are mentioned today, especially the State of Wildfires project and the Educator's Guide to Climate Science and Colonialism, mentioned by Maria and Doc Lau. And lastly, to our dear participants, please answer the evaluation survey with the QR code and link flashed on screen. We kindly ask that you share your honest insights about the webinar to help us improve our future sessions. Requests for e-certificates may also be coursed through the same form, and certificates will be released around a week from completion. Thank you again very much to Maria, to Dr. Barbosa, and of course, we'd also like to thank our sign language interpreters, Ms. Edna Comia and Ms. Annalisa Regis Tolentino, for making our event more inclusive and sustainable. And to all of you in the audience, thank you very much for your participation in this webinar. And we hope you've gained fresh insights, not just on wildfires, but also the importance of integrating and including the voices of the communities we work with. Please don't forget to accomplish our event evaluation form and visit the other links we have posted in the chat. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to return 2 minutes of your time back to you. Thank you, and happy Friday to all.